We went from nothing to just tremendous amounts of hardware that really needed managing. And so we did sort of the trade study that everyone else does to figure out why, and we started using Puppet a long time ago. So sort of my Puppet environment at Cloudera was, we had thousands of nodes, both bare metal and virtual, and we had, like everyone else, the challenges that you would have around scaling that sort of infrastructure. We had redundant Puppet masters, we had to load balance across Puppet masters, we had to scale the mirror infrastructure, we had lots of challenges. We had thundering herd problems, just like everybody else. The Forge really wasn't around when we started, so we started writing our own modules. Cloudera also had a challenge in that they support pretty much all the Linux. So CentOS and RHEL 5 and 6, Ubuntu, the LTSs, and the current release, Debian, Oracle, Scientific, so the cross OS support was actually a huge part of it. So, that is sort of a challenge in that a lot of modules now don't have that, but Cloudera solved it sort of a brute force way. We also had lots of different environments. So we had support engineers and QA engineers. We had the development, we had the operations people, so we had all these different environments. And the whole point was really to support this sort of huge test and development environment. So 95% of the hardware we had was to support test and develop. Like a little bit would get handed off to support from time to time, but mostly we were building clusters and tearing them down constantly, right? So we were always reprovisioning. It was reprovisioning mostly bare metal because Hadoop really is sort of a bare metal sort of software. So when I started at WibiData, we had nothing, literally nothing, not even an office, we had nothing. So like day one, they're like, okay, so we need you to build an office, we need you to deploy these services, we need you to do these things, and it all needs to be done in like a week. So go. And so having used Puppet for so long, it didn't even really, it wasn't even a decision I made, it was already done for me. So one of the things that I noticed though was I don't actually remember starting using Puppet at Cloudera. I remember what it was like when I was done, or when I left, and what the challenges that I had were, but I actually don't remember installing Puppet for the first time. And I don't remember anything about sort of the first year of using Puppet. It's a huge blur. So looking at doing it again, it's actually kind of overwhelming because Puppet is more than just a thing, right? There's an ecosystem around Puppet, and that ecosystem is large and getting larger. Like most successful open source projects, at some point the kernel, the main thing, starts to slow down, right? So Puppet, if you think of Puppet as being sort of the core of this ecosystem, the big enterprises or big companies need that thing to slow down, to become more stable, right? Like take less risks. I'm using it in production, I need it to work. And then what ends up happening is you get this huge ecosystem around it that starts growing up, and then all of the big risks and the new changes start to go into this ecosystem, and the course kind of slows down and becomes more incremental. And so, just looking at this ecosystem, it can be kind of overwhelming. And so when I first started to do it again, it was shocking to me that sort of overwhelming feeling of where do I start? Because I already knew all these challenges, and I had these preconceived notions of oh, I need to start, and I need to make sure that I can scale to 2,000 right away. It's actually, no, I don't, right? I'm not going to have 2,000 servers next week. I'm going to be fine. I can just start small, which is sort of the whole basis behind this talk. So really, there's only a handful of things that you actually need to get started with Puppet, right? And the first is DNS. Solve this problem for yourself. I don't care how you do it, but forward and reverse, make it work, rock solid, across your setup, and you will solve 90% of your problem. The second thing you need is hardware. Now, you don't need racks of hardware. We'll talk a little bit about 3 to 5. They can totally be virtual machines if you're really starting sort of small. You don't need to have massive dedicated hardware and load balancers, and then you need a plan. It's easy to kind of just jump into it without a plan, without thinking about how you're going to lay things out or what things are going to look like. And then what you end up finding is that you have to go back and kind of start again all the time. So the first place to start is which Puppet. And surprisingly, there's many, many different places to get Puppet. And your first option would be you can roll your own. It's a little more work. That what's going into it is the latest, right? It's fresh. That's great. It may or may not come together for you really well. The more you do it, the better you're going to get at it. Still, there are maybe potentially better options. So you could go to like the distro, sort of the neighborhood corner store. You could buy something prepackaged. That's great. The challenge there is it may or may not be that fresh, right? Like it might be an older version. It might have been sitting on the shelf for a while. And also the people who package this, while they're like pretty good, they also package like fried chicken, right? So like it's not necessarily the thing that they do every day. And so the package quality may or may not be what you want. Your third option is to go to people who actually know how to do this thing, right? And just get it straight from them. And so the other thing that's kind of nice about that is like it's not just the one thing, right? All the things go with it so that you can have the entire ecosystem in addition to just the core. So yeah, I'm advocating that you should go basically directly to Puppet. So now if you go to PuppetLabs, you have, and I will apologize in advance. I am a Linux person. I'm very Linux-centric. I generally think about sort of the relish distributions or the Debian-style distributions. I don't mean to leave out the rest, but that's just sort of my sort of background. If you're a BSD or a Unixer, like these things sort of apply, but to a different extent. If you're Mac and Windows, well, you should definitely talk to somebody else. So Puppet has open source repos for you if you're running in the sort of the relish RPM set or the Debian set. These are fairly bleeding edge. Like right now, I think the RCs might actually be in there for 3.0. And that might be great. You might be someone who likes living on that bleeding edge, who needs that latest feature, who wants that latest thing. And so you're willing to sit there on that sort of bleeding edge and constantly absorb those new features. There are the rest of the ecosystem, which I'm going to talk about. So when I talk about Puppet, I don't actually just talk about Puppet, right? Like Puppet and Factor are great, but they're only a very small part of this solution that I use internally. You can also go for Puppet Enterprise, right? So it's got a wider OS support. It's stable, right? So the releases come on a much slower tempo. For a lot of people who don't necessarily want to live on the bleeding edge, that's more appropriate. And the ecosystem gets tested as a whole, so that can be very useful. So bias alert, I run Puppet Enterprise, and I have run Puppet Enterprise since the very beginning. I was in the early betas, and I do run it. So I don't want to be a shill. I'm going to give a one sort of sentence explanation as to why I use Puppet Enterprise, and then I'll stop. If you want to talk to me more later, I'm happy to. So really the reason that I run Puppet Enterprise is Puppet is not my core business, right? Like my core business is building personalization systems for my customers. So every hour I spend on something for Puppet is an hour that I'm not spending on improving my product, right? So I work for a startup. I have limited number of hours before I run out of money. Like every hour I spend is very valuable to me. So Puppet isn't what I do for a living. I have many other jobs. On the other hand, Puppet is sort of this like force multiplication tool, right? So I can get a lot more done as a single individual, since I'm the only infrastructure guy currently, than I could without Puppet. And so Puppet has sort of become sort of important to the way that I do business. So you have this dichotomy. And then if something's wrong with Puppet, I need a solution, and I need it now, because I can't wait. So that's my Puppet Enterprise spiel. let's talk a little bit about sort of the solution space that I deploy. I do use Dashboard. It is my external node classifier. When I describe what a system looks like, I don't do it statically in a site or a node file. It goes into this. I may or may not have written some scripts that let me not use the UI, let me just go straight to the database. That's an option. There is going to be some work coming that lets you get around the GUI side of things. On the other hand, I have a CTO who is not a Puppet guy and who can use this interface to add people to clusters or take people off, or when I'm not there and I want to go on vacation, like he can do this, right? So for me, that's pretty nice. So Puppet database. Right now, it's mostly around like stored configs, exported resources, collected resources, that kind of thing, and some amount of inventory service. If you used to use Puppet before Puppet database and you did have to try to scale exported resources, you know that it was sort of a pain in the ass and actually really hard, and so a lot of people just would avoid it. PuppetDB sort of solved that problem, at least for me. I noticed that when it comes to exported resources, which I use a lot, virtual resources, which I use a lot, it has really sort of improved my life in terms of like making that work. And I also happen to know like things that are going to go into it. So part of my solution space is, while I don't want to depend on the fact that there will be a feature in 6 months or a year, I also want to like get ahead of that curve, because things that I need that are going to help me scale later, like I want to deploy those now. So sort of starting with the best practice up front is good for me. For those of you who are going to run POCs in your companies, if you're not running a POC on your laptop on VMs, there's no such thing as a POC. It's going to go straight to production, guarantee it, right? That has happened to me twice. There is no, unless you're on a VM on your laptop, you will just take that and immediately put it into production. So my recommendation to you is, when you do a POC on real hardware or on target hardware, do it right from the beginning, because you're going to potentially regret it when you have to then just basically drop that straight in, and you would have rather, oh, I would have wished I'd split those out, or I would have wished I put in DB, because none of us do this for a living, right? Like this, at least not Puppet, right? Like we have other jobs, and so like deploying a new database into your system may or may not be something that you can't just do on the drop of a hat. So I also use Hiera, and I hope that you will too. If not for some sort of classification system, for just getting configuration out of your modules, right? So if you are writing configuration about like very specific things into a file, like, oh, my NTB servers are here, my users are these, like that's not, for me, that's configuration as code is one thing, but I don't actually want those to be in the actual Puppet modules themselves, right? Because if you pull a module off the Forge, and your first thing that you have to do is open up a text editor to hack that module, that module is doing it wrong. Like the first thing you should do is pull it into your module path, and then go somewhere else and set some variables and be done with it, right? You shouldn't have to hack modules. The place that I hope that the Forge gets to is that it's sort of, I don't know, you could say it's kind of gemmy, like, I need this thing and I need it to work, right? I need NTP and I just want it to work. But I also I do have NTP servers. I might have several data centers. I need to kind of set this up. So using sort of this hierarchical database to actually set sort of the very specific parameters of your solution is going to be a lot more flexible in the long term. And you can also kind of separate the module code from your configuration. So I would recommend that. And I think this is going to come out as sort of a best practice around sort of module writing. Like you should look for modules that use Hiera. All right, so now we have a plan. Well, kind of a plan. We know that we're going to deploy these 3 things. And I'm going to deploy them on 3 different servers. These can totally be virtual machines. They don't need to be real hardware. They don't have to be all that big, like 4 gigs of RAM and a couple cores, like you're fine, right? For the average person that's like less than a couple hundred, you will be totally fine on some virtual machines. But if you split them out this way, when you have to grow one, because they don't scale at the same pace, right? You can totally just individually work on those 3 hosts. There are a couple optional sets, or optional hosts that I would recommend that you do deploy. One would be some sort of provisioning system, so some way to actually spin up a new host or tear it down. Because really, you should just be willing to throw away a server. Like, something's wrong with the server. All right, throw it away. Right. I have a problem, I can't figure it out, screw it. I'm just going to build it from scratch. I know it'll work. Right? This DNS host is a pain in my ass. All right, time for it to die. Do it again. I'm going to move it. Fine. I'm just going to burn it down and move it. And if you can get to that point, the point where you actually don't care at all about your server, like your server does not have a personality, like the fact that you killed it and burned it down did not hurt its feelings, right? So that will help you. Also, internal mirrors. If you are constantly redeploying, you basically want to have a local fast mirror of everything that you have. And one of the other sort of best practices is, package all the things and store them in a local mirror. So, all right, you have 3 hosts, and then now what? Like, great, you have a Puppet master, and what do you do? So these are sort of like the go-to things for me. All right, I'm going to put MTP on everything because it's brain dead, and it's going to make everything better. I'm going to start managing SSH. Sudo is like the quintessential example of like the first thing you can manage with Puppet, right? If you have no other problem to solve than dealing with sudoers, great. You can scale forever. Since I do use PE, I use a PE upgrade module because the upgrades path for PE is slightly different because it's not a repository that you just point to and say go. If you're a very small shop and you have 1 account, you don't need to roll out LDAP. You can if you want to. Certainly, that's perfectly reasonable. If you want to manage accounts, that's also a good way to go. The PE module has, or PE has a PE accounts module, which is sort of a wrapper around the basic user types and SSH keys, and it's just a very nice sort of easy way to manage it. I will say that if you do decide that you're going to manage accounts locally, congratulations, you get to manage all the accounts because you can't just manage one. So then my provisioning system of choice is Razor. Razor is relatively new. You can see a talk about it tomorrow. It's sort of a replacement for Cobbler or Foreman, which are sort of the alternatives. Razor is still in an early enough stage that if you're not comfortable hacking Ruby, may I suggest Cobbler or Foreman. So Cobbler is getting better. I used Cobbler for many years at Cloudera. I have a knee-jerk reaction which hates Cobbler, but it is better now than it was 3 years ago. So, and Foreman is totally worth looking at. The thing about Foreman is Foreman has a very sort of large belief on how things should be done. And if that fits in for your model, great. And if it doesn't, look at Cobbler or Razor. Internal mirrors, you should have them. Like generally, unless you're only deploying 5 servers, just get an internal mirror. One, you can control the software that you use, and you can step forward, and you know that every time you deploy a server, it's going to have the same packages as everything else because you're controlling that software, right? You're also going to be kind of your upstream, and you're going to have faster installs. So a word about scaling. If you are less than 100, you do not have to worry about it, right? My experience shows that power of 2 greater than 7, 128, 256, 512, 1024, 2048. Those are sort of the inflection points around scaling Puppet. If you are less than 100, congratulations, this will work for you forever, right? At the point at which you hit 200, you may or may not have to tweak some things. You should be, doing graphing. You should be watching catalog sizes. You should be watching, utilization. About the time you hit 500, maybe it's time to start looking at like, actual hardware. By the time you hit 1,000, yeah, you will probably have to do something like load balance Puppet Masters. All right, so we have all that stuff now. Now we can actually start doing modules. Kind of. So manage your modules like you would manage anything else. So my recommendation is to use Librarian. If you don't want to use Librarian, you can use Git submodules, which I hate, but it's totally a way to go. A monolithic repository is not what I would recommend, right? I did that for a long time. It's really a pain. If you want to release an individual module, you have to be very careful about, making sure that master is always shippable and that you have branches, and somebody's going to push a change that breaks something and you're going to try to deploy it. It's going to be a pain in the ass. Separate the modules. Where do you get modules? Well, number one place I would recommend is the Forge. If there's a module there, you should definitely try to use it. The thing about the Forge, though, is the Forge is sort of a front for GitHub, right? Like in the end, even when I go to the Forge, I find a module, I'm probably going to go to GitHub because I'm going to read the code first. And on GitHub, chances are you're going to have to fork the module. So the question about whether or not you should fork or not to fork is Patrick Dubois has a GitHub where he talks about stopping forking. I agree, stop forking, unless you're tuning something, right? Fork to tune, don't fork to live, right? Fork, add CentOS support, add Ubuntu support, add whatever, get that upstream, and when you have it upstream, go back to using upstream. We do not need 6,000 super modules. Use the modules that are there and help improve them. On the other hand, you might have to write your own module from time to time because you have something that no one else has a module for. Just make sure you're not reinventing the wheel. If there's already a solution for this, try to improve that solution, right? As a community, we only get better if we actually all help each other. So, get those modules in. You'll easily find who the authority is for a module, and you can kind of use those. So, all right, learning Puppet. Other than reading manifests, which is actually one of the best ways to learn Puppet. How do people learn Puppet? Well, you can go to the experts, right? You can the Pro Puppet book is very good. This is Gary. Gary's a trainer at PuppetLabs. He's not that angry, and the Puppet training is worth doing if you have a company that's willing to send you the training. But really, in the end, just start writing modules, or start reading modules and start improving on modules. That's the number one best way to get better at Puppet. There's lots of tools around this. Learn to love Vagrant. It's going to make your life a lot better when it comes to writing a module. There are two plugins that I sort of recommend. VWE is a way to make boxes, which are sort of the underlying images for Vagrant. And Sahara is a way that you can take a snapshot, try something out, and if it doesn't work, you can roll back to that snapshot, right? So it's really easy. Vagrant sandbox on, try something out, that wasn't right. I need to try that module again, roll back, rinse and repeat until you have it how you work. Vagrant, for me, at least in development, has sort of changed the way that I do development. Also, Vagrant is my testing framework for when I get a new version of P, when I get a new module, before it even thinks about touching production, it's going to go through Jenkins, it's going to go through Vagrant. I have a very small sort of setup, so I don't have the ability to have a huge test cluster, right? Like, I don't do environments because I really don't even have enough servers right now to do that. Oh, so we're done. If you have any questions about why my dog is sitting on the top of her crate, you may ask those.
She's not small anymore.
Well, she's not small, and actually she's really big now. So.